When it comes to historical ships, it is often hoped that they will become a museum. There are many examples of this in the modern day. However, some of the most famous and well-known ships of the 20th century did not become museums. This video will look at 3 examples, from the famous to the less well-known. In any case, this will be on the shorter end. This week was exhausting, and I'm fairly certain I caught something. That's why this isn't a traditional Sunday shipwreck video. That said, let's begin with one of the obvious examples. The name HMS Warspite is a legendary one. I don't think I need to say much about her history. The story of this ship is well known, and if you aren't aware of it, I have a video on her that I can link in the description. For the short version, this battleship was probably the most famous British battleship in history. Warspite fought at Jutland, enduring a horrific pounding that left damage to her steering that would never be properly fixed. The ship then served reliably during the interwar period, before becoming one of the hardest used battleships in the Second World War. One of the longest range hits from naval gunfire in history is attributed to Warspite, when she hit the Italian battleship Giulio Cesare at the Battle of Calabria. Warspite would, over the course of the war, fight the Italians multiple times. She would also fight in Norway and support operations in the Indian Ocean. Even when hit by an early guided bomb, the Fritz X, Warspite continued to soldier on, although the damage from that hit was crippling and never fully repaired. All of this earned her the famous nickname, the Grand Old Lady, and amounted to such a long and successful career that, even at the time, Warspite was one of the most famous and beloved ships in the Royal Navy. In the modern day, one would assume that made her a perfect candidate for becoming a museum ship. However, that obviously didn't happen. Warspite was, in fact, sold for scrapping in 1946, almost immediately after the war ended. She was then towed off for scrapping in April 1947, where she contrived to break her lines and run hard aground. One could see that as a final act of defiance in the face of death. That said, you probably already knew this, or at the least had an idea of it. For the purposes of this video, the question becomes, why scrap such a famous and historically significant battleship? Well, in the case of Warspite in particular, the answer is actually pretty simple. First and foremost, the British were broke at the end of the Second World War. So broke that it's difficult to put it in words if you didn't live through it. From what I've read and heard, the British were still rationing into the 1950s. They were in insane levels of debt, especially to the United States. Money was so short that the Royal Navy had to dramatically downsize, leading to many ships being decommissioned or outright scrapped. And some ships, like the Malta class, never came into being. One of the very few sources of hard currency in that situation was steel, especially high-grade naval steel. This is why you see so many ships be scrapped at the end of World War II, because the British just plain needed the scrap value. Getting any ship to become a museum was unlikely at best, when that cost money and the scrap value was so tempting. In the case of Warspite, however, that's only one part of the problem. The other issue was her material condition. You see, the single most difficult part of running a museum ship is keeping everything afloat. Maintaining a ship, especially a battleship, is not exactly cheap. It's why ships like Texas or Olympia got in such rough shape, or why ships sometimes get towed off for scrapping, even after becoming a museum ship. Warspite was, as mentioned before, very beaten up. The damage from the Fritz X was hastily patched with concrete and never properly repaired. It would have cost an obscene amount of money to get Warspite in museum condition. And that kind of money wasn't exactly common in post-war Britain. I don't even think it would have been common in the United States. And after spending who even knows how much on fixing the ship up, well, you'd still have to spend even more money on docking and on upkeep. So, between the scrap value and how expensive Warspite would have been to make a museum, her scrapping isn't a surprise. One can certainly disagree with it, however. I would have loved to see her in person. But this isn't a case where the scrapping makes no sense. The same applies to the second example. That example is one of the few ships more famous than Warspite. After all, even if you don't pay any attention to history, you have probably heard the name USS Enterprise. If only from a certain, long-running science fiction franchise. The ship that inspired things there was USS Enterprise CV-6. The Grey Ghost, the Big E, and a dozen other nicknames. Her story is easily one of the best known of any warship from any nation. Enterprise versus Japan, and all of that. This aircraft carrier fought from day one of the Pacific War to very nearly the end of it. Her planes were present at Pearl Harbor, and Enterprise was only pulled from active service during the engagement at Okinawa. Her actions off of Midway and Guadalcanal are justifiably the stuff of legend. There's a reason that Enterprise got an entire documentary series, Battle 360, based around her story. She earned 20 battle stars and several other decorations in addition to those. All of this is also why I'm not going to talk about her story in detail for this video. For now, let's just look at how her story came to an end. USS Enterprise, at the end of the Second World War, was no longer necessary. Much like Saratoga or Ranger, there wasn't a need for a pre-war aircraft carrier. Those ships had been worked hard and long, and the Navy had no shortage of newer and less worn-out ships. In fact, the Essex swarm was so large that the Navy couldn't even afford to keep all of them in service in the immediate post-war. As such, Enterprise was deactivated in January 1946, and then formally decommissioned on February 17, 1947. During this process, in 1946, there was a plan to hand Enterprise over to New York State as a museum ship. She would most likely have been moored in New York City had this plan gone through. Of course, it did not. Enterprise was decommissioned and left in the reserve fleet. Various plans would come and go during her period in reserve. Even Admiral Halsey would put his name forward in these attempts to save the ship. The unifying theme during this, however, was money. The Navy was very clear that anyone wanting Enterprise would have to put up the money to fix her up for a museum, not to mention secure a berth and move the ship to it. This was not cheap by any stretch of the imagination. One idea to tow her off to Washington, D.C. would have cost $1 million in 1957 money. That's something like $11 million in today's money. Ultimately, Enterprise, in spite of the efforts to save her, was sold for scrap on July 1st, 1958. From a historical perspective, this is an absolute tragedy. Very few ships have the story that Enterprise did, and even fewer had a real chance of being preserved. In the end, though, the money just wasn't there. A similar story can be seen in any of the attempts to preserve a conventionally powered supercarrier in the modern day. And in the same time frame as Enterprise, you had USS Hartford. That was Admiral Farragut's flagship in the Civil War, and she lasted until 1956, after coming very close to earning museum ship status. As for Enterprise, in addition to the money problem, there was the issue that, outliers like Texas aside, most museum ships came after she was scrapped. By the 1960s and on, the idea of a museum ship was much more appealing. More modern ships like North Carolina were coming out of reserve, and the will and money was there to preserve them. Enterprise had the misfortune to be on the very edge of lasting long enough for that. Her design, however, meant that she couldn't survive in the reserve fleet long enough. A few more years, and we might have seen her as a museum. But, alas, it was not meant to be. No matter how big a shame that is. Now then, let's move to the third and final example for today. The third example is a far less famous ship, unless you happen to be Turkish. Warspite and Enterprise are legends in their own right. Incredibly well known, both because of their illustrious careers and being covered in great detail. Yavuz, on the other hand, is a ship that rarely comes up. The former SMS Goban, this battlecruiser was the pride of the Turkish fleet for decades, but, well, Turkey. How many Western fans of naval history care about the Ottoman or Turkish fleet? And that goes double for more casual fans of history in general. It's a shame because Yavuz has such an interesting story that she remains one of, if not my longest, single ship video, which will be linked in the description for those interested in the full story. For this video, the story of how SMS Goban ended up in the Ottoman Empire is actually fairly well known. The Germans had two ships in the Mediterranean at the outbreak of the Great War. The battlecruiser SMS Goban and the light cruiser SMS Breslau. These two ships would make a break for the neutral Ottoman Empire, evading the British on the way there. The Ottomans, for their part, were all too happy to accept the ships into service to circumvent neutrality regulations. After all, the British had just seized two Ottoman dreadnoughts in full view of the crews sent to commission them. The Ottomans even kept the German crews, with Admiral Suchon becoming the commander of the Ottoman Navy, while the German crewmen took to wearing fezzes, because everyone knows that Turks wear fezzes. Am I right? In any event, this wasn't done to draw the Ottomans into the war. That would come later when the aforementioned German admiral bombarded Sevastopol to force the issue. I went over this in more detail in the Yavuz video, where I mentioned the exact chain of events there is a bit foggy. Regardless, Goban, by now renamed to Yavuz Sultan Selim, was now the flagship of the Ottoman Navy. With her name shortened to just Yavuz, she would remain the flagship of the Turkish Navy when the Ottoman Empire collapsed. After a long and twisting saga of repair and refits, she remained in service from 1930 until the end of 1950. With the result that there's pictures of this First World War battlecruiser next to the USS Missouri in 1946. While decommissioned in 1950, Yavuz remained in reserve long enough to get a NATO hull number in 1952. She was only formally stricken in 1954. Yavuz would then hang around until the Turkish government offered to sell her to West Germany as a museum in 1963. The Germans refused, however, and Yavuz was ultimately sold for scrap in 1971, which concluded by 1976. While I can understand why West Germany declined the offer, this one does burn a bit. And not just because I'm an unashamed fan of Imperial German Grossekreutze. At the time she was scrapped, Yavuz was, in order, the last battlecruiser, the last Dreadnought-era capital ship outside of USS Texas, the last Imperial German warship, and the longest-serving Dreadnought-style ship in any navy. While she may not have had the most exciting career after the end of the Great War, Yavuz was an incredibly historically significant ship. Her scrapping is really quite a shame. Although, again, I can understand. West Germany wasn't overflowing with money in the 1960s, and there was still a concerted effort to look to the future and not to the past. In any case, with Yavuz's fate, we come to the end of this video. Ideally, I should be feeling better by next weekend, and we can return to the usual Shipwreck Sunday video. Maybe one of the Japanese heavy cruisers. Thoughts for later, I suppose. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.